which our next guest will say is a crucial element in the war for both Russian forces and also Ukrainians. Dr. Tom Withington is an expert in electronic warfare, and he joins us now from Toulouse in France. Thank you for joining us here on BBC News, Dr. Withington. I'd like to start off with first, what does electronic warfare mean exactly?
Well, that's a very good question. So I like to use the analogy of the human body. So if you think about a military, the brains of the soldiers, their perception, that is the brain of the army, brain of the Air Force, Navy, doesn't really matter. The limbs, well, they're the weapons, they're the ships, the aircraft, the bullets, the bombs. The electronic spectrum, and crucially radio, is the nervous system, and it's also the way that that body, if you like, senses. And it's the only area of warfare that human beings cannot perceive. We cannot taste it, we cannot see it, we cannot hear it. But the electromagnetic spectrum, which is where radio waves reside, and it's these radio waves that carry orders to soldiers, carry those soldiers' situation back to their commanders so those commanders can make decisions. That's why electronic warfare is so important, because it targets that use of the electromagnetic spectrum.
So how would you say it has been used in this conflict so far? Have you seen evidence of it? Can you pinpoint it just by looking at developments on the ground?
Well, like your colleagues, it's very difficult to get definitive information out of the Ukrainian theatre at the moment. But what we are seeing is a surprising lack, in some ways, of Russia's attempts to control that radio spectrum, to attack it, and to ensure that the Ukrainians cannot use it to their own advantage. At a very superficial level, we're seeing mobile phone footage coming out of Ukraine. We're seeing people use the internet. We're seeing on your reports the satellite communications. All of these technologies rely on the use of radio. Now, in previous wars, in Syria, in Ukraine from 2014, the Russians worked very, very hard to attack that use of radio. This time around so far, it's still early days, we're still a week into the war. We haven't seen that to such an extent. It has been happening, but not to the same extent. And that in itself raises some very interesting questions, and it also potentially hands a good advantage to the Ukrainians.
Now, there is a map that you've very kindly put together, so hopefully this will illustrate what we're talking about. And this looks like areas where you believe, well, you describe it, the areas in blue. What are we looking at?
Well, it's very kind of you to showcase my haphazard artwork. So just to talk you through what we're seeing at the moment. Effectively, the blue shaded areas are estimates that myself and my colleagues have made on the size of the coverage, the size of the electronic warfare coverage, the Russian units in those areas could be able to execute. Now, what that would mean, effectively, is that any radios or any radars that are within those blue circles could be attacked. Now, what we call that in the phrase is jamming. So we use interference, electronic warfare experts use interference to stop those radios working, to stop them transmitting. It's a bit like when you're in your car and you go through a tunnel and the radio stops working, or it used to when we had analog radios. That's really the same effect. And so those blue spheres are sort of aiming to give an idea of where that electronic warfare coverage could be. And as you can see, they correlate roughly with where Russian units are based at the moment. It's not an exact map, it is hypothetical, I'd add those caveats, but hopefully it gives people an idea of how that kind of electronic warfare coverage is done.
Okay, now I'm sure many people who've been following this crisis have picked up on the story of Elon Musk being brought into it and his Starlink. What is it and how is that helping?
Well, Starlink is an interesting technology. It's a constellation of micro-satellites, very small satellites. And Mr. Musk's idea is really to cover the world with these, and it will mean that anybody can have fast broadband internet coverage wherever they are, not using the cell phone towers, not using the fibre optics as we do at the moment, but just simply beaming their traffic, beaming their messages, whatever it is, to these little satellites above them. And the terminals that he's supplying is a way of ensuring that Ukrainians can still have access to the internet. Should the Russians make a concerted effort, should they be able to cut off Ukraine's links to the outside world, its telecommunications, its internet, that kind of thing. And one of the things, from what I've heard about these terminals and about the way that Starlink works, is it can be quite difficult to jam. So that's obviously another advantage for any Ukrainians who can use those terminals, who can come across them and use them. Of course, the challenge with putting this thing into any combat theatre is, on one hand, if you like, you want the good guys to use it, but you don't want the bad guys to be able to get their hands on it and also use it. So that will be a challenge. But it's an interesting technology, and I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Couldn't electronic warfare then essentially end a war? I mean, it sounds very powerful.
You know, potentially it probably can't end a war on its own, but it can certainly contribute to the end. Now, going back to the Second World War, Field Marshal Montgomery once said that if we lose the war in the air, we lose it, we lose the whole war, and we lose it quickly. I think to an extent that's the case with the electronic spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum of it. It's hard to see how a modern military can fight efficiently if it is denied access to radio, to radar, to that way of sensing and to exchanging messages. And then coupled with other aspects on the battlefield, such as the Ukrainian army's ability to maneuver quickly, to maneuver advantageously. Effectively, that means attacking the Russians in a way that they don't expect and they don't anticipate. Then it could certainly make an important contribution.
Okay, Dr. Tom Withington, it's been fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.